It's 1988 and the Glasgow Garden Festival is in full swing. But what remains of the site of the festival in 2022? And did any of the attractions survive? Find out now in this episode of Astonishing Glasgow. The Glasgow Garden Festival was the third of 5 national garden festivals which were held between 1984 and 1992, with funding provided by the government to promote urban regeneration in towns and cities hit by industrial decline. Glasgow's festival was the most successful, with 4.3 million visitors over the 152 days it was held through the summer of 1988. The then derelict Plantation Quay in Govan was transformed into 120 acres of colourful gardens, pleasant walkways and exhibits, all designed to showcase Glasgow's history and culture. Gardens and attractions were provided and sponsored by local businesses and universities, as well as towns, cities and councils from throughout Scotland. I was 11 years old at the time of the festival, and thanks to my parents, we had season tickets. We spent time there at least once a week, as well as getting a ticket to the royal opening. But I think at that I only caught a brief glimpse of Princess Diana's bodyguard's bald patch. Now, before I get started, I have to point out the huge help I have had making this episode. It turns out that getting hold of pictures from the festival is really quite hard, but thanks to all the people who answered my pleas on Facebook and Instagram and donated the use of their pictures, this video has been made possible. At the bottom of any pictures that were not taken by my dad, I have added a credit, as well as a list of contributors at the end of this video. It's also been nearly a year's worth of site visits to get the footage, so don't be surprised at the way the seasons change throughout the episode. With that, on with the video. So on a site that covered 120 acres, I suppose the best place to start would be at one of the entrances and at the biggest remaining structure from the festival. This is the Bells Bridge, and it formed the way-in point from the north side of the Clyde. Built especially for the festival in 1988, it gets its name from the Arthur Bell and Sons Whisky Company, who sponsored its construction. At the time it was built, this was the last bridge on the river before Erskine, and its revolutionary design allows it to open by swinging on its central pier. River traffic was rare by 1988, but the Waverley still berthed at Atlantic Quay then, so the bridge had to open to allow passage. In 2006, the Squinty Bridge was built, blocking the Clyde at Finniston, and the Waverley now berths at the Science Centre, so the Bells Bridge rarely opens. It was supposed to be temporary, like most of the festival's features, but it survives to this day, but not without work. By 2010, the canopy panels had been removed and the paintwork was faded, but it would provide essential for the Commonwealth Games in 2014, so it underwent renovation at the cost of 1.6 million and still looks pretty good now. As you cross the bridge now, you arrive at a passageway between the BBC studios and a hotel, but in 1988 the view was far more colourful.
Fireboat, hoses play, and the festival site crowded with season ticket holders, many of them, as you will see later, in costume. The great gates of the festival.
As you pass through the gates, you will arrive at the High Street, the main retail area of the festival, which was decorated with colourful representations of Glasgow's most important buildings, and a good place to buy a spool for your camera. 36 exposure if you're feeling rich, and if you don't want to wait in a shop, you might be able to flag down the mobile film shop. But to backtrack towards the bridge and the gates you've just walked through. These large cast iron gates had been removed from the Royal College building on George Street in the city centre in the 1960s, and had been in storage for nearly 40 years. They were loaned to the Garden Festival by the now owners, the University of Strathclyde, and assembled at the entrance. After the festival, The gates were returned to the university, who reinstated them to their original location on George Street, where you can still see them today. Notice that one of the arched railings from the top of the gate was turned upside down to form these railings at the festival. I'll bet that 99% of visitors went through these gates without even registering their existence. Their eyes were probably drawn more towards the bandstand that stood behind them. This is the Overtoun Bandstand, which was built by Walter McFarlane and Co. in their Saracen foundry in Postle Park in 1914. It was built for Sir James Fleming, who donated it to the Overtoun Park in Rutherglen before it was dismantled and reassembled for the Garden Festival in 1986. 1986? Not a mistake. This bandstand has the distinction of appearing at the 1986 Garden Festival in Stoke-on-Trent before being dismantled again to be shown at the 1988 Glasgow Garden Festival. After the festival, the bandstand was moved back to Overtoun Park, where it stands to this day. Now 118 years old, it is looking a little bit neglected these days, but it is easily visited from the Roger Drive entrance of the park. Well, that was the Bells Bridge entrance, but there was one other entrance to the festival, and this is the one that I would have used most often as I came from the south side of the city. This entrance stood where the Springfield Quay Entertainment Complex now stands. The entrance and ticket building was sold off after the festival, along with a lot of the other structures and shelters. We'll see more of these later in the video, but this building was bought by Klondike Garden Centre in Polmont near Falkirk. It was used to form the front of the garden centre, and for many years there was a Glasgow Garden Festival logo above the doorway, but by the time I visited, it looks like things have been remodelled and the logo has vanished. This wasn't the only part of the festival that the Klondike Garden Centre purchased, however. Sadly now derelict and hidden out back by the bins and the fire escapes is this once beautiful Japanese pagoda, which stood proudly at the festival in 1988. It looks to me like the chance to save this pagoda is fast running out, so it may not be here much longer, and I can't help thinking it would look great in the winter gardens at the People's Palace. The festival was such a huge event for Glasgow, and the only artefacts on display in the city that I could find are some uniforms in the Kelvingrove art galleries. Anyway, Klondike isn't the only garden centre in Scotland that purchased parts of the festival when it ended. The late Eric Gallagher stepped in and purchased around 20% of the shelters and railings and brought them to Cardwell Bay Garden Centre near Gourock. Thankfully, the festival relics have survived much better and been very well looked after here. They really give Cardwell Bay Garden Centre a very unique feel. It's well worth a visit, and many thanks to Kieran Gallagher and the team for helping me with information and access for filming. Whilst I was in Gourock, I went in search of another piece of the festival, but spoiler alert, I was a few years too late. The big yellow kettle stood not too far from the entrance, and in 1994 it was relocated to the waterfront in Gourock as a tourist information centre. It was never very popular, however. Landmark or eyesore, opinion was divided, and after falling into disrepair it was removed and scrapped just 3 years later. As I drive back to Glasgow, now's a good time to ask you to hit that like and subscribe button if you are enjoying this video. Check out my other episodes of Astonishing Glasgow, and if you feel really generous, please make a donation with the super thanks button. It'll help me produce more episodes of Astonishing Glasgow. Now, of all the parts of the festival, it seems like the majority of what people remember and what survives today was in this narrow section. We've seen what happened to the kettle, but the roller coaster was also in this area. That survives today in Lowestoft, England at the Pleasurewood Hills theme park, now known as the Wipeout ride. Another thing that many people seem to remember vividly was the big tap. It was one small piece of the site. It was huge for a tap, but on the site it was one small piece. And when talking about the project, a surprising amount of people remembered the big tap. Part of the Cumbernauld sponsored New Generation Garden, the tap and the Big Fork and Trowel found themselves relocated to Calder's Garden Centre just off the M80 near Cumbernauld. Sadly, the tap is no longer in display. It must have finally run out of water, but the Big Fork and Trowel can still be seen on the way in. A lot of the festival site is now hard to access, as it is private gardens for the blocks of flats that were built after 1988. But as I make my way along the river, it is important to point out that not all the buildings on the site were built especially for the Garden Festival. The South Rotunda of the Old Clyde Tunnel, a story for a different episode of Astonishing Glasgow, was used as the Dome of Discovery, and slightly further along was the Four Winds building. Originally the pump house for the docks, the Four Winds building became the storage and maintenance shed for the fleet of tramcars that operated at the festival. The building hasn't changed much in passing years, though it might be difficult getting a tram up those steps now. As we're on the subject of vintage transport, trains were surprisingly well represented at the festival. There was a miniature railway that ran around the site and was served by 3 locomotives, made to look like old steam locomotives, but these ones were powered with diesel engines. British Railways had the cab of an HST on site, and that's me in the driver's seat. And on the other side of the quay from the Clydesdale Bank Tower, which now lives in Rhyl in Wales by the way, was this great display put on by Central Regional Council. The Heart of Scotland station, locomotive and wagons stood right here, though there is not much trace today. To pinpoint its exact location, look at the faint curve in the grass and these post holes. In this old picture you can see the curve, and the post holes were the anchor points for the British Steel Bridge that carried the miniature railway over the quay opening. To find these exhibits today, I had to get back in my car and head east. The building was originally Monifeith Station near Dundee. It was moved to the festival site, then moved again by the Scottish Rail Preservation Society. If you take a train on the Bowness and Kinneil line, and if you're really lucky, a steam train, look out the window as you pass Birkhill Station. That is the very station that stood at the Garden Festival, though the colour has now changed. I very nearly missed this footage, as the station crept up on me while I was enjoying the ride, and an Empire biscuit from the buffet car. Thankfully I had a second attempt on the way back down the line. When I did get back to Bowness, a hunt around the Scottish Railway Museum found the current resting place for the Kelton Fell, the small locomotive from the Garden Festival, as well as what looks like the same tanker wagon. Astonishingly though, the Heart of Scotland signs were lying on the floor of the museum, propped up against the wall. I had absolutely no idea this was here, and it really felt like a lucky find. There was one other piece of railway history at the Garden Festival that was returned to Bowness, but I didn't see it on my visit in 2022. By complete luck, I took these pictures back in 2014 of the locomotive Lady Victoria in the sidings at Bowness. I didn't realise she'd been on display as part of a playground at the festival until I started this project. Is it still at Bowness, or is she now somewhere else? Perhaps you can let me know, because I didn't see her this time. Back on the festival site and on display near the station was the Vulcan. This was a replica of a barge with the same name from 1818 that was used as a passenger barge on the Forth and Clyde Canal. The original was made of iron, but this replica was built in steel by apprentices of British shipbuilders in Govan, and holds the distinction of being the last vessel built on the Clyde using traditional riveting techniques. She's now on display at the brilliant Summerlee Museum in Coatbridge. She looks like she could do with some maintenance, but I am absolutely sure the museum volunteers will look after her when they get a chance. Now I hope you're still with me on this story of Garden Festival relics. It really is turning into a bit of an epic episode. But it's time for a couple of sculptures that have survived in the intervening years. The first statue is by the sculptor, wait for this, Charles d'Orville Pilkington Jackson, and it has quite a history too. First being exhibited at the Empire Exhibition in Bellahouston Park in 1938. It was loaned to the Garden Festival by the National Trust for Scotland, where it is permanently on display at Greenbank Gardens near Newton Mearns. If you decide to go for a visit yourself, look out for the hand-embroidered panel created by the Friends of Greenbank Gardens sewing group in the cafe. I had a lovely slice of caramel shortcake when I was there. The next sculpture is slightly more modern. The Motherwell tree was one of 5 sculptures at the festival by George Wiley. George Wiley is known amongst other things for the clock outside Buchanan Street in Glasgow city centre, the big safety pin in Rotten Row Park, and for suspending a straw locomotive from the Finiston crane. As you would expect by the name, the Motherwell tree now resides in Motherwell, and you can find it on the Mary Street shopping precinct. Right, is everybody still with us? Just let the stragglers at the back catch up. Right then. On the site of the festival, there are still some derelict areas, but gradually these are being swallowed up by developments. Housing was always planned for the site, even before the festival was mentioned, but after a lot of inactivity, the Science Centre, BBC Scotland and STV studios were built on the site, and more recently, hotels and homes have appeared. The one part of the Garden Festival site that is protected from development is the area that is now known as Festival Park. Almost untouched, you can still clearly see how it looked during the festival, though the spirit of the festival pavilion, sponsored by Bowmore Distillers, has gone and the lake has filled with weed. It is interesting to see the path of the stream, though that too has dried up, and then follow it back to the waterfall, which although still there, it has aged like a fine milk. Now full of weeds and litter, it is a long time since water flowed over its cascades. You'll have to believe me that this is the same site. Behind the weeds you can still find the steps of the cascade. Follow them right to the top, and here's the opening where the electric pump would be, now no longer working because its maintenance is not a high priority. So what did the Garden Festival leave the city? Physically, not a lot. There's the bridge, the park, and, if you follow the path to the back of the Grand Old Opry on Paisley Road Toll, the festival logo is built into the wall of the tenements. But that's about it. The buzzword for modern events is legacy. I think the legacy of the Garden Festival outweighs the physical remains. After 1988, Glasgow's image as an industrial wasteland started to be forgotten. Glasgow was the European City of Culture in 1990, which had a lot to do with the festival. It could be argued that without the festival, the city would not have won the Commonwealth Games in 2014, COP26 in 2021, and a place on the shortlist for 2023's Eurovision Song Contest. Every year more and more tourists are heading to Glasgow, who would never have thought of the city as a destination in the past. And all these events and opportunities for the city lead right back to that hot summer at the Garden Festival in 1988. For now, that's my tour of the Garden Festival over. I may do more relics of the festival in the future if I can find them, but for now, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the super thanks button if you would like to make a donation, and help me make more episodes of Astonishing Glasgow. A huge thanks to this list of superstars. Without your pictures and help, this video wouldn't have been possible. Thank you to everybody who has watched to the end, and see you all soon for the next episode of Astonishing Glasgow. Wowee, 11-year-old me's got knobbly knees or what? Anyway, that was a hell of a lot of talking. I'm away to gargle some honey. See you next time. Bye bye.